I don't care what the readings say, Dr. Morrison. We've tried everything in your arsenal, and this man is still coding every 20 minutes. The voice belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, chief cardiac surgeon at Mercy General, and right now, her hands were shaking as she stared at the monitor displaying Richard Whitmore's failing vitals. The billionaire CEO of Whitmore Industries lay motionless on the hospital bed, his skin the color of ash, his breathing shallow and mechanical through the ventilator tube, forcing air into his collapsing lungs. Around her, 19 other physicians, cardiologists, neurologists, toxicologists, specialists flown in from Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic, scrambled between machines that beeped warnings nobody could silence. His oxygen saturation just dropped to 78%, someone called out. Push another round of epinephrine, Vasquez commanded, though her voice carried the hollow ring of someone who'd run out of answers 3 hours ago. Richard Whitmore wasn't supposed to die. Men like him didn't die in hospitals surrounded by the best medical minds money could purchase. They didn't slip away despite having access to experimental treatments that hadn't even been approved by the FDA yet. But his body was shutting down organ by organ, and nobody in this room, not the Harvard-trained immunologist adjusting his IV drip, not the renowned pulmonologist checking his lung function, not even Vasquez herself, with her 30 years of experience, could figure out why. The billionaire had collapsed during a board meeting that morning. One moment he'd been shouting at his executives about quarterly projections. The next, he was on the marble floor of his conference room, convulsing violently while foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. His security team had rushed him to Mercy General in his private helicopter, and within 40 minutes every specialist Vasquez could summon was standing in this suite. That was 8 hours ago. Since then, they'd run every test conceivable. Blood work showed his white cell count was catastrophically elevated, suggesting a massive immune response, but to what? His brain scans came back normal. His heart had suffered minor damage from the repeated crashes, but nothing that explained the severity of his condition. They'd tested for poisons, for rare tropical diseases, for autoimmune disorders, so obscure they appeared in maybe 3 cases worldwide per year. They'd pumped him full of broad-spectrum antibiotics, antivirals, immunosuppressants, steroids that should have reduced any inflammation to nothing. Nothing worked. Every intervention bought them maybe 30 minutes before his body rebelled again. His blood pressure would spike, then plummet. His heart would race to 160 beats per minute, then suddenly drop to 40. His kidneys were starting to fail. His liver enzymes were climbing to levels that indicated acute hepatic injury. It was like watching a system destroy itself from the inside out, attacking its own tissues with the ferocity of a wildfire consuming dry timber. We need to consider the possibility of an unknown pathogen, Dr. Morrison said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was a virologist who'd helped contain outbreaks in 3 different countries, and even he looked rattled. Something his immune system can't recognize and is overreacting to. We've already started him on every antiviral and antibiotic combination available, Vasquez snapped back. If it were infectious, we'd see some response by now. Then what? Morrison's voice cracked. What are we missing? Nobody answered because nobody knew. The machines continued their urgent symphony of alarms. Richard Whitmore's chest rose and fell mechanically, each breath a gift from the ventilator rather than his own failing body. His face, which had graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes dozens of times, looked sunken and ancient. He was 53 years old, but right now he could have passed for 80. Vasquez forced herself to think through the timeline again. He'd been healthy that morning, according to his personal physician, Dr. Carlisle, who was currently standing uselessly by the window because his patient had progressed far beyond anything a general practitioner could handle. Whitmore took medication for high blood pressure and high cholesterol, standard for a man his age with his stress levels. He'd eaten breakfast at 6, attended his board meeting at 8, collapsed at 9:15. What did he eat? Vasquez asked suddenly. Dr. Carlisle turned from the window. I'm sorry? Breakfast. What did he eat for breakfast? I don't know. His usual, I suppose. His staff prepares his meals. Get them on the phone, now. I want to know everything he consumed in the last 24 hours. While Carlisle fumbled with his cell phone, Vasquez returned her attention to the monitors. Richard Whitmore's oxygen saturation had climbed back to 84%, a marginal improvement that would probably disappear within minutes. His heart rate had stabilized at 95. These tiny victories felt hollow when she knew another crash was coming. The room smelled like antiseptic and desperation. 20 brilliant minds reduced to guessing, to throwing medications at a problem they couldn't diagnose. Vasquez had spent 3 decades in medicine, had performed surgeries that other surgeons called impossible, had saved patients who arrived at her ER more dead than alive. But this was different. This felt like fighting an invisible enemy that knew exactly where to strike and how to avoid every defense they mounted. His core temperature is rising again, a nurse announced. 103.8. More ice packs, Vasquez ordered, and increased the cooling blanket setting. The door to the private suite opened with a soft click that somehow cut through all the noise. Vasquez didn't turn around. She was too focused on adjusting Whitmore's medication drip. But she heard Dr. Morrison bark out, "No visitors. This room is restricted to medical personnel only. I just need to bring fresh water. I don't care what you need to bring. Get out, now." Vasquez finally glanced toward the door and saw a woman standing just inside the threshold. She was middle-aged, maybe 60, with dark skin and graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a plain blue uniform, the kind housekeeping staff at Whitmore's mansion probably wore, and held a small tray with a pitcher of water and empty glasses. Her expression was soft, almost apologetic for the intrusion. "You heard the doctor?" Vasquez said, gentler than Morrison but equally firm. "We can't have anyone non-essential in here right now." The woman didn't move. Her eyes had fixed on Richard Whitmore's face with an intensity that seemed out of place for household staff. Vasquez watched her dark eyes trace the billionaire's features, noting the pallor, the way his lips had taken on a bluish tinge despite the oxygen mask, the slight tremor in his hands even while unconscious. "Please," Morrison said again, his patience evaporating. "We're trying to save this man's life." The woman's gaze remained locked on Whitmore. Her grip on the tray tightened until her knuckles paled. Then, so quietly that Vasquez almost missed it beneath the cacophony of medical equipment, she spoke 2 words. "Check allergy?" The room didn't fall silent. The machines couldn't stop their warnings. The ventilator couldn't pause its rhythm. But something shifted in the air. Every doctor within earshot turned toward the woman in the doorway. Morrison's face flushed red with anger. "Excuse me?" he said. "We've already ruled out." "Check his allergy," the woman repeated, louder this time, her voice steady despite the 20 pairs of eyes now fixed on her. "To penicillin." Vasquez felt ice water flood her veins. No, they couldn't have, they wouldn't have. Her hand moved automatically to the IV stand beside Whitmore's bed, where 6 different medication bags hung, their contents dripping steadily into his bloodstream. Her eyes scanned the labels. Saline, epinephrine, a vasopressor to maintain blood pressure, an antiarrhythmic for his heart, a sedative to keep him comfortable. And there, the 6th bag, clear liquid, standard broad-spectrum antibiotic. Her vision narrowed on the generic name printed in small black letters, amoxicillin, a penicillin derivative, one of the most common antibiotics prescribed in modern medicine, so common that it was practically invisible, so basic that when they'd been throwing everything at this mysterious condition, someone, she couldn't even remember who, had added it to the cocktail of interventions without a second thought. Her hands fumbled for Whitmore's chart, clipped to the end of his bed. She flipped past the recent notes, past the test results, back to the admission paperwork that had been filled out in. Those frantic first minutes when he'd arrived by helicopter. There, on page 3, in a section that should have been highlighted in red, in letters that should have been 3 inches tall, was a single line under known allergies. Penicillin, severe reaction. The chart fell from Vasquez's hands and clattered to the floor. "Turn it off," she whispered. "What?" Morrison stepped closer. "Turn off the amoxicillin!" Vasquez lunged for the IV stand, her fingers working frantically to clamp the line that had been steadily poisoning Richard Whitmore for the past 8 hours. "Get me activated charcoal and antihistamines now. We need to flush his system immediately." The room exploded into action. Doctors who'd been standing around helpless suddenly had direction, purpose. The penicillin drip was disconnected within seconds. New medications were prepared and pushed through Whitmore's IV. Someone called for emergency dialysis to help clear the allergen from his blood faster. The team that had been fighting an invisible enemy now had a target, and they attacked it with the precision their credentials promised. Vasquez's mind raced through the implications. Penicillin allergy in adults typically manifested as a rash, maybe some gastrointestinal distress, but severe reactions, anaphylaxis, could trigger exactly what they'd been seeing: the cardiovascular instability, the difficulty breathing, the multi-organ involvement as his immune system waged war against what it perceived as a lethal threat. They'd been treating the symptoms while continuously reintroducing the cause, hour after hour, drip by drip. They'd been killing him while trying to save him, and none of them had thought to check the allergy list. "How is this possible?" Morrison said, his voice hollow with dawning horror. "How did we miss this?" Vasquez had no answer, or rather, she had too many answers. They'd been focused on exotic possibilities instead of basic protocol. They'd been so certain it was something complex, something worthy of their collective expertise, that they'd skipped over the fundamentals. They'd been arrogant, and that arrogance had nearly cost Richard Whitmore his life. She turned toward the door where the maid still stood, tray clutched in her hands, watching the controlled chaos unfold. The woman's face showed no triumph, no satisfaction at being right, just concern, deep, genuine concern for the man lying in that bed. "How did you know?" Vasquez asked. The woman set her tray down on a nearby counter with careful precision. "I've worked for Mr. Whitmore for 17 years, she said quietly. "I've seen him take medication every day. I've watched him carefully check every prescription, every supplement, every vitamin. He's vigilant about it because when he was younger, a doctor gave him penicillin for a throat infection, and he nearly died. He told me about it once years ago, when I asked why he was so careful. He said he never wanted to feel that helpless again." Morrison opened his mouth, probably to make some excuse, but Vasquez shot him a look that could have melted steel. This woman, this maid who cleaned Whitmore's house and brought him water, had saved his life. She'd done what 20 of the nation's top physicians couldn't do. She'd paid attention. "What's your name?" Vasquez asked. "Grace," the woman replied. "Grace Washington." "Grace." Vasquez moved toward her, away from the bed where her team was now working with renewed purpose. "Thank you. I mean that. Thank you for speaking up." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to Whitmore. "Is he going to be okay?" Vasquez followed her gaze to the monitors. Already, within just minutes of stopping the penicillin drip and starting the antihistamines, there were changes. Small changes, but changes nonetheless. His oxygen saturation had climbed to 89%. His heart rate, which had been erratic for hours, was settling into a more normal rhythm. His blood pressure, while still elevated, was no longer spiking into dangerous territory. "I think so," Vasquez said, and for the first time in 8 hours, she actually believed it. "I think he's going to be okay." The next 30 minutes confirmed it. Richard Whitmore's vitals continued to improve as the allergen cleared from his system. His oxygen levels rose. His heart stabilized. The inflammation markers in his blood began to drop. It wasn't an instant recovery. He'd sustained significant damage during those hours of anaphylactic shock, but he was climbing back from the edge. The machinery of his body, no longer under attack, began to repair itself with the resilience that had made him a billionaire in the first place. Vasquez ordered continuous monitoring and adjusted his medication regimen, removing anything penicillin-based and flagging his allergy in 3 different places on his chart. She made sure every nurse, every resident, every person who might come into contact with Richard Whitmore knew about the sensitivity that had nearly killed him. Then she turned to find Grace still standing by the counter, watching silently. "You can go," Vasquez said softly. "We've got him from here." But Grace didn't move. She stood there like a sentinel, like she'd been standing guard over Richard Whitmore all along, and had no intention of leaving until she was certain he was safe. There was something in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, that spoke to a loyalty that ran deeper than employer and employee. Vasquez had seen family members stand that way. She'd seen spouses and children maintain that vigil, but she'd rarely seen it from household staff. "I'd like to stay," Grace said, "if that's permitted." Vasquez should have said no. Hospital protocol was clear about limiting visitors in intensive care situations, but she looked at this woman who'd saved her patient's life and found she couldn't enforce the rules. Not this time. "You can stay," she said. Grace nodded and settled into a chair. In the corner of the room, her presence somehow both invisible and undeniable. She didn't speak again. She just watched, her dark eyes tracking every movement of the medical team, every change in the monitors, every shallow rise of Richard Whitmore's chest. By midnight, 12 hours after his collapse, Richard Whitmore's condition had stabilized enough that Vasquez felt comfortable stepping away. His oxygen levels were holding at 93%. His heart rate was 72 and steady. His blood pressure had normalized. They'd dodged a bullet, or rather, Grace Washington had pulled them out of the line of fire. Vasquez found herself back at the nurse's station, writing detailed notes about what had happened. She documented everything: the missed allergy check, the penicillin administration, the dramatic reversal once it was stopped. This would be reviewed. There would be meetings, inquiries, possibly disciplinary action. 20 doctors had failed where one observant maid had succeeded, and that failure would have consequences. But right now, consequences didn't matter. Richard Whitmore was alive, and that was what counted. She signed her notes and looked back through the window into his suite. Grace was still there in her corner chair, still watching, still waiting. Vasquez wondered what thoughts ran through that woman's mind. Did she understand the magnitude of what she'd done? Did she realize that her 2 words, check allergy, had been the difference between life and death? Probably she did. Grace Washington struck Vasquez as the kind of person who understood exactly what mattered and what didn't, who saw clearly while others got lost in complexity. That kind of clarity was rare. That kind of attention to detail was precious. Vasquez made a note to herself to recommend Grace for some kind of recognition. A letter to Whitmore's company, maybe. Something to ensure that this woman's contribution didn't get lost in the aftermath, didn't become just a footnote in Richard Whitmore's medical file. She deserved more than that. The night shift nurses took over monitoring duties. The specialists drifted away, returning to their own hospitals and practices, their prestigious positions, their comfortable assumptions that they were the smartest people in any room they entered. Morrison left without a word, his face still pale with the realization of how close they'd come to catastrophic failure. Dr. Carlisle, Whitmore's personal physician, promised to review all of his patients' medications and ensure something like this never happened again. And through it all, Grace Washington remained, silent, steady, watching over the man whose floors she'd mopped and whose meals she'd served and whose life she'd saved with 2 simple words. When dawn broke through the hospital windows, painting the sterile room in shades of gray and gold, Richard Whitmore's eyes finally opened. The first thing he saw, Vasquez would learn later, was the ceiling. Wide, tiles, fluorescent lights, the universal view of hospital patients everywhere. The second thing he saw, when he managed to turn his head, despite the protests of muscles that had been locked in crisis for nearly a day, was Grace Washington sitting in her corner chair. She stood when she noticed him stirring, moved closer to the bed with the quiet grace her name promised. Whitmore tried to speak, but the ventilator tube prevented it, and within moments nurses descended to begin the process of extubation. Vasquez arrived shortly after, called by the nursing staff, and supervised as they removed the breathing tube and assessed whether Whitmore could maintain his own oxygen levels. He could. His lungs, though weakened, were functioning. His voice, when it returned, was raspy and painful. "What happened?" he managed to whisper. Vasquez explained it carefully, clinically, not sparing any details about how close he'd come to death. She told him about the penicillin, about the missed allergy notation, about the 8 hours of deterioration, and then she told him about Grace. Whitmore's eyes found his maid again. Grace had retreated back to her corner, giving the medical team space to work, but she hadn't left. 17 years of service had apparently created a bond that went beyond professional obligation. "You," Whitmore said, his voice barely audible, "you saved me." Grace's expression remained neutral. "I just remembered what you told me, Mr. Whitmore, about being careful with medications, about the allergy. 20 doctors." Whitmore's laugh turned into a cough that made the nurses fuss over him. When he could speak again, his eyes had turned hard, calculating. This was the man who'd built an empire through ruthless intelligence and the ability to see value where others saw nothing. 20 of the best doctors money can buy, and none of them remembered to check the basics. But you did. I pay attention, Grace said simply. Yes, Whitmore agreed. You do. Over the next 3 days, as Richard Whitmore recovered and regained his strength, a transformation occurred that nobody in his orbit could have predicted. The billionaire CEO, known for his cutthroat business practices and his ability to discard people the moment they ceased being useful, became fixated on the woman who'd saved his life. He asked questions. He learned that Grace was a widow, that her husband had died 7 years ago from cancer, that she had 2 grown children who lived on the opposite coast. He learned that she'd been cleaning houses her entire adult life, that she'd worked for a dozen wealthy families before coming to his mansion 17 years ago, that she sent money to her grandchildren for college. He learned that she'd saved not just his life, but potentially his entire legacy, with nothing more than observation and the courage to speak up when 20 experts told her to leave. On the 4th day, when Whitmore was strong enough to sit up and receive visitors, he asked for his lawyers. Not his doctors, not his business associates, his lawyers. They arrived within the hour carrying briefcases and concerned expressions. Whatever Whitmore had summoned them for must be important. Grace was still there. She'd gone home only twice in 4 days, and only because Whitmore himself had ordered her to get rest. She'd returned each time within hours, resuming her vigil. The nurses had stopped questioning her presence. Even Vasquez, who'd initially enforced strict visitor protocols, had given up trying to remove her. Grace Washington belonged in that room as surely as the monitors and the medical equipment. When the lawyers left 2 hours later, they looked confused but not displeased. Whitmore had that effect on people. You weren't always sure what he'd just convinced you to do, but you left feeling like you'd accomplished something important. The next morning, Vasquez arrived for her rounds to find Richard Whitmore out of bed, standing by the window with the help of a physical therapist. His recovery had been remarkably swift once they had removed the allergen from his system. His organs had bounced back. His heart had healed. In another day or two, he'd be ready for discharge. "Dr. Vasquez," he called when he saw her. His voice was stronger now, carrying that authoritative tone that had cowed boardrooms. "I need you to gather everyone who was here that first day. Every doctor, every specialist. Can you do that?" "They're scattered across the country," Vasquez said. "Some of them flew in specifically for your case and have since returned to their hospitals." "I don't care if they're on the moon. Get them here. Tell them I'm paying their travel expenses and their consulting fees for another day. Tell them it's mandatory." His smile was thin. "Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but I want them in this room tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Vasquez had no idea what he was planning, but she made the calls. The power of Richard Whitmore's name and wealth was enough to bring them all back. Dr. Morrison from Boston, the neurologist from Cleveland, the toxicologist from Houston. All 19 of the specialists who'd failed to save him filed back into Mercy General the next day, curiosity and concern written across their faces. They gathered in Whitmore's suite at exactly 2 o'clock. The billionaire was dressed now, in casual clothes his staff had brought from home, looking more like his old self, despite the pallor that still clung to his features. He stood by the window, backlit by afternoon sun, while Grace Washington sat in her usual corner chair. The doctors noticed her, but said nothing, probably assuming she was hospital staff. "Thank you all for coming," Whitmore began, his voice filling the room the way it had filled countless boardrooms over his career. "I wanted to speak to you face to face about what happened last week." The doctors shifted uncomfortably. They all knew what had happened. They all knew they'd missed something catastrophically basic. "You're the best in your fields," Whitmore continued. "Your credentials are impeccable. Your training is beyond reproach. You've saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. I don't doubt your competence or your dedication, but you nearly killed me." The silence that followed could have choked a lesser man. Dr. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but Whitmore held up a hand. "I'm not here to berate you or assign blame. Medical errors happen. I understand that. What I want you to understand is this. My life was saved by someone you dismissed, someone you ordered out of the room, someone you thought was too insignificant to listen to." He gestured toward Grace. "This woman, Grace Washington, who has cleaned my home for 17 years, did what none of you could do. She remembered what mattered. She paid attention to details you overlooked. And when she tried to tell you, You told her to leave. Grace's face remained impassive, but Vasquez saw her grip tighten on the armrest of her chair. I've made a decision, Whitmore said. Grace will no longer be cleaning my house. Starting next week, she'll be managing the Whitmore Foundation, a new charitable organization I'm establishing with an initial endowment of $500 million. The foundation will focus on healthcare access and education for underserved communities, people who can't afford the kind of medical dream team I had, people who need advocates like Grace, who notice things, who speak up even when they're told to be quiet. The doctors stared. Grace stared. Even Vasquez, who thought she'd moved beyond surprise in her medical career, found herself speechless. Grace, Whitmore turned to face her directly. You saved my life. None of these highly educated, highly compensated professionals could do it, but you did. I want you to use my money to save more lives, build clinics, fund research, train healthcare workers, whatever you think will make a difference. I trust your judgment more than I trust my own. Grace stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know the first thing about running a foundation. You'll learn, Whitmore said simply. You're observant, you're thoughtful, you care about people. That's more important than any MBA or nonprofit management degree. I'll hire administrators to handle the logistics. You'll provide the vision. The foundation will be named after you, the Grace Washington Foundation for Healthcare Excellence. Tears gathered in Grace's eyes, the first emotion Vasquez had seen her display in all the days she'd maintained her vigil. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Whitmore replied. Say you'll take this opportunity to help people the way you helped me. Say you'll use your gift for noticing what others miss to make sure patients get the care they deserve. Grace looked at the assembled doctors, these titans of medicine who'd been humbled by her quiet intervention. She looked at Vasquez, who'd learned a painful lesson about assumptions and protocols. Then she looked back at Richard Whitmore, the man whose life hung by the thread of her memory and her courage to speak. Yes, she said, I'll do it. Whitmore's smile was genuine this time, reaching his eyes in a way his business associates would have found shocking. Good. My lawyers will handle the paperwork. You'll have full access to the foundation's resources. I want this to be your legacy, Grace, not mine. Yours. He turned back to the doctors. As for all of you, I'm not suing. I'm not filing complaints with medical boards. But I am requiring one thing. Each of you will donate 1 day per month to the Grace Washington Foundation, providing free medical services to patients who need them. Consider it penance. Consider it education. Consider it whatever you want, but you'll do it, all of you. Nobody argued. How could they? They'd been outmaneuvered by a maid who cleaned toilets and noticed allergy notations. Their pride had already taken a fatal blow. A day of free clinic work seemed like a small price to pay. Over the following weeks, as Richard Whitmore completed his recovery at home and returned to running his empire, the foundation took shape. Grace Washington, who'd spent her entire adult life in service positions, found herself sitting in an executive office with a staff of advisors and administrators. She approached it the same way she'd approached cleaning houses, with attention to detail, with care for the work itself, with respect for the people it affected. The foundation's first initiative was establishing allergy verification protocols in hospitals across the country. Grace had learned, through conversations with Vasquez and other healthcare professionals, that what had nearly killed Richard Whitmore happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Busy emergency rooms, overworked staff, patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, all created opportunities for critical information to be missed. The foundation funded training programs, developed better charting systems, created redundancies to catch errors before they became fatal. They worked with hospital administrators to implement checks and balances that prioritize patient safety over efficiency. They sponsored research into why medical errors occurred and how to prevent them. Within a year, the Grace Washington Foundation had partnered with 30 major hospitals. Within 2 years, they had established 10 free clinics in underserved areas. Within 3 years, Grace had become a sought-after speaker at medical conferences, telling her story not to shame the doctors who had missed the allergy, but to remind healthcare providers that sometimes the most important information comes from unexpected sources. Vasquez attended one of those conferences, sitting in the audience as Grace spoke to a room full of physicians about the importance of humility in medicine, about listening to patients and their families, about remembering that degrees and credentials meant nothing if you couldn't perform the basics correctly. After the presentation, Vasquez approached Grace backstage. They'd stayed in touch over the years, professional respect having evolved into genuine friendship. "You've come a long way from that day in the hospital," Vasquez said. Grace smiled, that same calm smile she'd worn, while keeping vigil over Richard Whitmore. "I'm doing the same work I've always done, paying attention, noticing what matters. The context is different, but the principle is the same." "How is he?" Vasquez asked. She'd heard that Whitmore had stepped back from day-to-day operations of his company, focusing instead on philanthropy and the foundation he'd created in Grace's name. "He's good," Grace said. "Different than he was. Near-death experiences change people. He's more patient now, more willing to listen. He jokes that I gave him more than his life back. I gave him perspective." Vasquez nodded. She'd seen that transformation in patients before, though rarely in billionaire CEOs. "And you? Are you happy with how things turned out?" Grace considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "I miss cleaning sometimes," she admitted. "There's something satisfying about taking a mess and making it orderly, but this..." She gestured at the conference hall, at the audience of doctors who'd just heard her story. "This feels like cleaning too, in a way, taking a system that's messy and broken in places and helping make it better. So, yes, I'm happy. I'm doing work that matters." "You were always doing work that mattered," Vasquez said quietly. "We just failed to recognize it." Grace's expression softened with understanding, with forgiveness. "You're recognizing it now. That's what counts." 5 years after nearly dying from a missed allergy notation, Richard Whitmore held a gala to celebrate the Grace Washington Foundation's accomplishments. The event took place in the ballroom of his mansion, the same mansion Grace had cleaned for 17 years. But now she entered through the front door as an honored guest, wearing an elegant dress and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. The ballroom was filled with donors, healthcare professionals, and beneficiaries of the Foundation's programs. There were patients whose lives had been saved by the improved allergy protocols. There were medical students who'd received scholarships from the Foundation. There were doctors who'd learned humility through their monthly clinic rotations. Whitmore took the stage to give a speech, but he kept it brief. This wasn't his night. It was Grace's. 5 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "I learned the most important lesson of my life. Wisdom doesn't always come dressed in credentials. Grace Washington saved me not because she had medical training, but because she had something more valuable. She had attention, compassion, and courage. She noticed what 20 specialists missed. She spoke up when she could have stayed silent. And in doing so, she didn't just save my life, she changed it." He gestured for Grace to join him on stage. She rose from her seat with the same steady grace she'd displayed in that hospital room, walking through applause that grew louder with each step. "The foundation bearing your name has already changed healthcare in measurable ways," Whitmore continued when Grace stood beside him. "But more importantly, it's changed how healthcare providers think about their work. You've reminded us all that the person who cleans the floors might see what the person reviewing the charts missed. That listening matters as much as knowing. That kindness and attention can be as powerful as any medication." He turned to face her directly. "Thank you, Grace, for saving my life, for accepting this challenge, for showing all of us what real service looks like." Grace took the microphone with hands that no longer trembled when speaking to crowds of powerful people. "I accepted this position because Mr. Whitmore believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," she said. "But what I've learned over these past 5 years is that what I did in that hospital room wasn't extraordinary. I just paid attention. I just remembered. I just spoke up. Those are things everyone can do, in whatever role they fill." She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. "We make a mistake when we assume that only people with certain titles or certain degrees can make a difference. The housekeeper sees things. The receptionist hears things. The parking attendant notices things. All of us have information, observations, insights that matter. The question is whether we have the courage to share them and whether the people in power have the humility to listen." The applause that followed was more than polite recognition. It was acknowledgement of a truth that made some people uncomfortable. Hierarchies and credentials could blind as easily as they could illuminate. After the gala, after the donors had left and the caterers had cleared the ballroom, Whitmore and Grace stood together in his study. It was a room Grace knew well from 17 years of dusting the bookshelves and vacuuming the Persian rug. But tonight, she sat in one of the leather chairs reserved for important visitors, while Whitmore poured them both drinks. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, handing her a glass of wine. "Leaving behind the simplicity of housekeeping for the complexity of running a foundation?" Grace accepted the wine and considered the question as carefully as she considered everything. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Running a foundation means meetings and budgets and politics. It means making decisions that affect thousands of people. It means being responsible for outcomes I can't always control. That's harder than cleaning floors or organizing closets. But," Whitmore prompted. "But I can do more good this way," Grace said simply. "I can help more people. I can prevent the kind of error that nearly killed you from happening to someone else. Someone who doesn't have your resources, your access to care. Someone who might not survive what you survived." Whitmore nodded slowly. "I've thought about that a lot. About how many people die from preventable errors because nobody notices, or because the person who notices doesn't speak up, or because the person who speaks up isn't heard. Your 2 words, check allergy, they haunt me. Not because they saved me, but because of all the times those words weren't said, or weren't heard. That's why the foundation matters," Grace said. "We can't prevent every error, but we can create systems and cultures where errors are less likely to happen and more likely to be caught before they cause harm. We can train people to pay attention, to speak up, to listen. That's worth the meetings and the budgets and the politics." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 people from radically different worlds who'd been brought together by crisis and transformed by its aftermath. Whitmore had learned humility. Grace had learned that her observations and instincts were valuable beyond the domestic sphere. Both had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is notice what everyone else overlooks. "I've been thinking about mortality," Whitmore said eventually. "About legacy. I built a company worth billions. I've got my name on buildings and products. But none of that will matter as much as this foundation, as your work. That's what I want to be remembered for. Not the money I made, but the lives we saved because I was smart enough to listen to you." Grace smiled. "You'll be remembered for both. And that's not a bad thing. You built something that created wealth and jobs and opportunities. But yes, this is different. This is about service rather than profit, about giving rather than taking, about making the world a little better, one prevented error at a time." The years continued to unfold. The Grace Washington Foundation grew in scope and influence. Medical schools began incorporating their training materials into curricula. Hospitals adopted their protocols as best practices. The culture of medicine shifted, slowly but perceptibly, toward greater humility and better systems for catching errors. Grace herself became a symbol of how attention and courage could change outcomes. Her story was taught in ethics classes, used in leadership seminars, referenced in policy discussions. The woman who'd cleaned toilets for a living had become an influential voice in healthcare reform, not through credentials or formal education, but through the simple power of being right when it mattered most. Richard Whitmore, true to his word, stepped back from his business empire to focus on philanthropy. He donated the majority of his wealth to the foundation, ensuring it would continue long after both he and Grace were gone. He made amends in his way for a lifetime of ruthless business practices by dedicating his remaining years to improving systems that affected the most vulnerable people in society. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been humbled by Grace's intervention, became the foundation's chief medical advisor. She used her position to advocate for better training, better protocols, and better cultures in hospitals across the country. She never forgot the lesson she'd learned in Richard Whitmore's hospital suite. That expertise meant nothing if you didn't couple it with attention to detail and willingness to listen. The other 19 doctors who'd missed the allergy notation fulfilled their commitment to the foundation, donating 1 day per month to free clinics in underserved populations. Some did it grudgingly at first, viewing it as penance for their failure, but over time, most came to see it as the most meaningful work they did. The free clinics reminded them why they had entered medicine in the first place, not for prestige or profit, but to help people who needed help. One doctor, Dr. Morrison, the virologist who'd snapped at Grace to leave the room, became particularly devoted to the foundation's work. He couldn't undo his initial dismissal of Grace's observation, but he could honor her contribution by serving others. He eventually left his prestigious position to work full-time for the foundation, leading their infectious disease initiatives in developing countries. 10 years after the incident, Grace Washington stood before a congressional committee testifying about healthcare reform. She was older now, her hair completely gray, but her eyes were as sharp as they had been that day in the hospital. She spoke about the need for better error reporting systems, about the importance of listening to all voices regardless of their position in the medical hierarchy, about creating cultures where speaking up was encouraged rather than punished. A senator interrupted her testimony. "Ms. Washington, with all due respect, you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, you have no medical training. Why should Congress listen to your recommendations about health care?" Grace met his gaze without flinching. "Senator, you're right. I'm not a doctor, but I saved a man's life when 20 doctors couldn't. I did it by paying attention to something simple that everyone else overlooked. My lack of credentials didn't make my observation less valid. It didn't make those 2 words, check allergy, any less important. Maybe that's exactly why you should listen, because sometimes the people closest to the ground see what the people in the tower miss." The committee room fell silent. Then another senator, one who'd read the foundation's reports on medical errors and their prevention, spoke up. "Ms. Washington is right. We've been approaching healthcare reform as if only experts have valuable insights, but patients, families, support, staff, they all have perspectives we need to consider. Ms. Washington, please continue your testimony." Grace did. She spoke for 2 hours, backing up her experiential knowledge with the data and research her foundation had compiled over a decade. She presented evidence that better communication systems, more inclusive decision-making processes, and greater attention to basic protocols could prevent thousands of preventable deaths each year. She made a compelling case for systemic change rooted not in expensive technology or complex interventions, but in simple human attentiveness and willingness to listen. The legislation that eventually passed didn't go as far as Grace wanted, but it incorporated many of the foundation's recommendations. Hospitals receiving federal funding had to implement error reporting systems that protected whistleblowers. Medical schools had to include training on communication and hierarchy in their curricula. Insurance companies had to cover costs associated with medication, allergy testing, and documentation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Lives would be saved, errors would be prevented. And it all traced back to 2 words spoken by a woman who cleaned houses for a living. Richard Whitmore died at 72, having lived nearly 20 years beyond the day he should have died in that hospital suite. He passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family and with Grace Washington holding his hand. In his final months, he'd told her repeatedly that every day he'd lived since she saved him was a gift. Every grandchild he'd met, every sunset he'd seen, every person helped by their foundation. All of it was borrowed time made possible by her attention and courage. His funeral filled a cathedral. Business leaders eulogized his entrepreneurial genius. Politicians praised his philanthropy, but the most moving tribute came from Grace herself, who spoke last. "Richard Whitmore was a complicated man," she said to the assembled mourners. "He was brilliant and driven and sometimes ruthless, but he was also capable of change. When faced with his own mortality and his own fallibility, he chose growth over defensiveness. He chose service over ego. He chose to build something that would outlast him and help people he'd never meet." She paused, her voice thick with genuine grief. "I worked for him for 17 years before he saw me. Really saw me. Not the maid, not the help, but me. Grace Washington. A person with observations and insights worth hearing. That near-death experience opened his eyes to what he'd been missing, and once he saw, he couldn't unsee. He dedicated the rest of his life to making sure other people's voices were heard, other people's observations were valued." Grace looked out at the crowd, at the doctors and nurses and patients whose lives had been touched by the foundation. "We all have the power to do what I did that day in the hospital. We all can pay attention. We all can speak up. We all can listen when someone else speaks." Richard's legacy isn't just the foundation or the money or the buildings with his name on them. His legacy is the reminder that wisdom can come from anywhere, and our job is to be humble enough to recognize it. The foundation continued after Whitmore's death, endowed with enough money to last generations. Grace remained its director for another 5 years before stepping back to let younger leadership take over. She'd created something sustainable, something that would continue saving lives and improving healthcare long after she was gone. In her retirement, Grace returned to the work she'd always found most satisfying. She volunteered at a hospice facility, providing comfort and care to people in their final days. She wasn't cleaning houses anymore, but she was still paying attention, still noticing what others missed, still making a difference in simple, profound ways. A young nurse at the hospice once asked Grace about her remarkable life, about the journey from maid to foundation director to healthcare reform advocate. Grace's answer was characteristically straightforward. "I just did what needed doing," she said. When Mr. Whitmore was dying and nobody could figure out why, what needed doing was remembering his allergy. When he asked me to run a foundation, what needed doing was accepting that challenge and learning how to do it well. When Congress needed to hear about healthcare errors, what needed doing was testifying. "I'm not special. I'm just someone who pays attention and tries to help." "But you are special," the young nurse insisted. "You saved a man's life. You changed healthcare policy. You've helped thousands of people." Grace smiled. "Everyone is special. Everyone has something unique to contribute. The question is whether we notice what needs noticing, whether we speak when we need to speak, and whether we listen when others speak. That's not about being special. That's about being present and paying attention and caring enough to act." That philosophy became the cornerstone of the Grace Washington Foundation's mission, that everyone has valuable observations, everyone deserves to be heard, and systems should be designed to capture wisdom regardless of where it originates. It was a radical idea in hierarchical healthcare settings, but it was also an idea whose time had come. By the time Grace herself passed away at 83, the foundation she'd shepherded had expanded to 40 countries. It had trained over 10,000 healthcare workers in better communication and error prevention. It had funded free clinics that served millions of underserved patients. It had lobbied for and won policy changes that saved an estimated 50,000 lives per year through better allergy documentation and medication management. But perhaps more importantly, it had changed the culture of medicine itself. A generation of doctors and nurses had grown up hearing Grace's story, learning that humility and attention were as important as knowledge and skill. They had learned to listen to patients, to value input from all sources, to check the basics before assuming complexity. Her memorial service was held in the same ballroom where Richard Whitmore had celebrated the Foundation's 5-year anniversary. The room was filled with people Grace had touched, doctors who'd learned humility from her example, patients whose lives had been saved by the protocols she'd established, students who'd received scholarships from the Foundation, staff members who'd worked alongside her for years. The Foundation's current director, a physician named Dr. Jennifer Chen, who'd been inspired to enter medicine after hearing Grace speak at her college, gave the main eulogy. "Grace Washington proved that you don't need credentials to change the world," Dr. Chen said. "You need attention, courage, and compassion." She had all three in abundance. She noticed what 20 specialists missed. She spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent. She cared enough about a man who employed her to make sure he received the right care. And when given the opportunity to translate that experience into systemic change, she rose to the occasion with the same quiet grace she'd brought to every aspect of her life. Dr. Chen paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. "But here's what Grace would want us to remember. We all can do what she did. We all can pay attention in our own contexts. We all can speak up when we notice something wrong. We all can listen when someone else tries to tell us something important. We all can choose service over ego, humility over arrogance, care over indifference." That's Grace's legacy. Not that she was extraordinary, but that she showed us how ordinary actions, noticing, speaking, listening, can have extraordinary consequences when we have the courage to follow through. The Foundation established an annual Grace Washington Award for Excellence in Patient Advocacy, given to healthcare workers who exemplified her qualities of attention, courage, and humility. The first recipient was a janitor who'd noticed a patient's deteriorating condition and alerted nurses when the patient was too weak to call for help himself. The second was a receptionist who'd caught a dangerous medication interaction by listening carefully to a patient's symptoms. The third was a transport aide who'd insisted on delaying a surgery when he noticed the consent form listed the wrong procedure. These were the kind of heroes Grace had championed, people doing essential work who paid attention and spoke up when it mattered, people who might have been dismissed as just housekeeping or just administrative staff, but who had proven that there was no just about it. Everyone in a healthcare setting had the potential to save lives if they were attentive, and if the system empowered them to be heard. 20 years after Grace's death, a medical student named Marcus Williams wrote his doctoral thesis on the cultural impact of the Grace Washington Foundation. He traced how the foundation's emphasis on attention, humility, and inclusive decision-making had reduced medical errors by 43% in hospitals that fully implemented their protocols. He documented how changing the culture to value input from all staff levels had improved patient outcomes across multiple metrics. He showed, with rigorous data and analysis, that Grace's simple act of speaking 2 words, check allergy, had created ripple effects that had saved an estimated 1 million lives over 4 decades. But the thesis's most powerful section wasn't about statistics or outcomes. It was about stories, story after story of near misses caught, of errors prevented, of lives saved because someone paid attention and spoke up and was heard. A nursing assistant who noticed a patient's oxygen mask wasn't working properly. A cafeteria worker who overheard concerning symptoms a patient mentioned to a visitor. A volunteer who recognized that a medication being prepared was the wrong color. None of these people were doctors. None had medical degrees. But all of them had been empowered by a culture that valued their observations, and their attention had made the difference between life and death. That was Grace Washington's true legacy. Not the buildings or the endowment or even the policy changes, important as those were. Her legacy was a fundamental shift in how healthcare systems thought about wisdom, authority, and attention. She'd proven that you didn't need credentials to save a life. You needed care, attention, and courage. And she'd built systems that honored those qualities wherever they appeared. The story that began with a dying billionaire and a maid holding a water tray had become something much larger. A movement, a philosophy, a different way of understanding what made healthcare effective. Grace had shown that the person who cleaned the floors might see what the person reading the charts missed, and in seeing that truth and acting on it, she'd changed medicine forever. Today, decades after Grace Washington spoke 2 words that saved Richard Whitmore's life, medical students around the world learn her story in their first week of training. They learn it not as a feel-good anecdote, but as a foundational principle. Pay attention to everything, listen to everyone, check the basics before assuming complexity, and never dismiss someone's observation based on their position or credentials. They learn that the most expensive medical intervention means nothing if you miss the simple allergy notation on page 3 of the chart. They learn that 20 brilliant minds can be wrong while one attentive person can be right. They learn that humility, attention, and willingness to listen aren't soft skills. They're survival skills for patients and practitioners alike. And they learn Grace's own words, spoken in her congressional testimony and now inscribed on a plaque in the Foundation's headquarters. Everyone can notice, everyone can speak, everyone can listen. Those simple actions, repeated across a system, can prevent suffering and save lives. You don't need permission to pay attention. You don't need credentials to care. You just need courage to speak when you notice something wrong and humility to listen when someone else speaks. That was the lesson of Richard Whitmore's near death and Grace Washington's intervention. That was the foundation, literally and figuratively, upon which a better healthcare system was built. That was the story that began with 2 words and became a movement that changed how medicine itself was practiced and understood. It wasn't a story about miracles or extraordinary genius. It was a story about ordinary human attentiveness applied at a moment when it mattered most. It was a story about speaking up despite hierarchies that said, you shouldn't. It was a story about listening even when pride said you didn't need to. It was a story about how the smallest actions, checking an allergy, noticing a patient's pallor, remembering a conversation from years ago, could cascade into consequences that shaped the world. Grace Washington had spent 17 years cleaning Richard Whitmore's mansion, invisible to him despite being present in his home almost daily. Then she spent one moment being visible, speaking 2 words that everyone else had failed to speak. And those 2 words, check allergy, became the foundation of a legacy that outlived both of them, that saved millions of lives, that changed how an entire profession thought about wisdom and worth and the value of every human observation. That was the power of paying attention. That was the power of speaking truth regardless of your position. That was the power of systems that listen to all voices rather than just credentialed ones. And that was the story that proved beyond any doubt that heroes don't always wear white coats or carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they wear cleaning uniforms and carry water trays. Sometimes they save lives not with cutting-edge medicine, but with basic human attention to what matters. Grace Washington had changed the world by doing the simplest thing imaginable. She'd noticed, she'd remembered, she'd spoken. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone that those simple acts, repeated, honored, and systematized, were the foundation of truly excellent care.